even though we have a lot to cover, I want to slowly back up a little bit into the last assignment on page 241 or thereabouts. It's actually continuous with the beginning of today's first reading because it has to do with Kierkegaard. And the question of the moment, and in particular the instant in Kierkegaard. For those of you who haven't noticed it, I just want to call your attention to the fact that Chuck and Alia have recently asked some questions that have on the forum, the question and answer forum, and from my perspective, especially the first question that Chuck asked led me to put down on the forum something that hopefully will relate to when we get into the even deeper waters of the thinking now occurring, which, by the way, I think we're going to start doing next week. And it connects to something in Kierkegaard, particularly this notion of the existing of the moment, as I was trying to position it recently, the existing in some sense, in effect, the Kantian moment, which in one way or another we can understand as time itself, in the sense that time for Kant does not change, although things in time change, that constitutive root, so to speak, of our experience of time and space. And Kierkegaard, and that comes up because Kierkegaard focuses on the moment as his way of understanding the what is created when the eternal, as he puts it, enters into time or becomes historical. And that happens in the moment, and or as it's sometimes translated, the instant. So just picking up on that theme here, on page 241, quoting Kierkegaard in The Concept of Dread, just about the middle of the page, if one thinks it possible to maintain this division, it is because we spatialize a moment. But even so, it is not correctly thought, for even in this visual representation, the infinite succession of time is a present infinitely void of content. On the contrary, the eternal is the present. For thought, the eternal is the present as an annulled succession, a very Hegelian thing for Kierkegaard to say. The eternal is the present as an annulled succession. Time was succession going by. The eternal is the annulment of that, as it were, the reducing of that continuous succession of instants, the reduction of that continuous succession of instants to nothing, so to speak, right? That occurs, or that is what the eternal is, looked at from a Hegelian point of view. Likewise, in the eternal, there is not to be found any division of the past and the future, because the present is posited as the annulled succession. So time, says Kierkegaard, is infinite succession. The life which is in time and is merely that of time has no present. The present is the eternal, or rather the eternal is the present, and the present is full. If I just kind of slow the film down, if not my rendition, the present is the eternal. The life which is in time is merely that of time has no present. The present is the eternal. That kind of radical contrast. The implication there is that if time has no real present of its own, what may appear to be a present is always slipping away, right? In other words, it's the underlying radical nothingness of the finitude which Hegel has identified with the temporal, right? So it's not so, for Hegel, it's more profound than, Kant speaks of things changing in time, although time itself does not change. That's Kant's point. But Hegel takes it a little more deeply, as he does everything else in Kant, and he kind of he riddles things with their temporality, All right, so it's not so much that there are things in time for Hegel, meaning finite things that are in time, but the things are finite because they are, as it were, through and through, they're temporal, right? They are passing away in their very being. They are ultimately, in their very nature, reducible to nothingness, right? So Kierkegaard is accepting, in effect, this understanding, the Hegelian understanding. The present is the eternal, or rather the eternal is the present, and the present is full. So put it extremely, in other words, what Kierkegaard seems to be saying and is saying, you see, is that the only real present, the only thing that stays, right? The only thing that is a present in a full sense is the eternal, right? And so there is no present unless the eternal enters into time and creates a present with a past and a future by virtue of the fact that it has entered into time. The eternal also characterizes the present as having no past and no future, and this is the perfection of the eternal. That is, the present as such, for Kierkegaard, insofar as the present is the eternal, has no past and future, and the past and the future that is created by its entering into time is something that, since there is no present in time, in the mere succession of time, that are lacking even to time by itself, apart from the entrance of the eternal into it. If one would now employ the instant to define time, and let the instant indicate the purely abstract exclusion of the past and the future, and by the same token of the present also, then the instant precisely is not the present, for that which in purely abstract thinking lies between the past and the future has no existence at all. But one sees from this that the instant is not a mere characterization of time, for what characterizes time is only that it goes by, which I was saying a moment ago, right? And hence time, if it is to be defined by any of the characteristics revealed in time itself, is the past time. On the other hand, if time and eternity are to touch one another, it must be in time, and with this we have reached the instant. Thus understood, the instant is not properly an atom of time, but an atom of eternity. It is the first reflection of eternity in time, its first effort, as it were, to bring time to a stop. All right, so that, let me pause there in the middle of that. Again, going back to what seems to be turning out to be a fundamental notion here, that it's a great thing about rereading your own book, right? The passage that I quote from Kant on the angel of the apocalypse is really fundamental, okay, as it turns out, because Kant is at pains to say, again, that the angel of the apocalypse, if we're not to assume that he was speaking nonsense, could not have, strictly speaking, meant that time was going to come to an end when he blew the bugle, right? But that change would come to an end, right? Because it's inconceivable that time itself should come to an end, because, as I was saying in previous sessions, it, in the meantime, will have taken on as the unchanging something of that quality of the eternal now of the sacred doctrine of Thomas Aquinas. But notice, Kierkegaard is, in his own way, all right, he's aware of this problem, so to speak, that time itself does not come to a stop, you could say, in any sense for Kierkegaard, right? And if there's going to be an end to time, it can only happen if the eternal enters into it. The synthesis of the eternal and the temporal is not a second synthesis, but it is the expression for the first synthesis, in consequence of which man is a synthesis of soul and body sustained by spirit. No sooner is the spirit posited than the instant is there. All right, so the psychosomatic being, okay, is, now this, by the way, follows Paul. In a certain way, that particular trinity is not original to Kierkegaard, right? Body, soul, and spirit is the Pauline way of understanding the structure, as it were, of human being. But what Kierkegaard is doing is that he's identifying the level of spirit. This is, by the way Paul really, in effect, understands the possibility of the resurrection, right? that is the transformation of the spirit which informs the psychosomatic unity that man is in the world, that transformation of it would be the resurrection of the body in the pneuma, right? In the spirit. So the resurrection is it's a spiritual body, or it's a body which is informed by the Spirit of God, and as such, all right, it now is enabled it to have a life, or it now has a principle of life that it previously will not have had in the purely natural realm.
The resurrection of the body, I may have misheard this,
okay,
is purely pneumatic?
Yeah, the resurrected body, Paul says, is, well, yes, it is. That's literally the case. Everything depends. The little subtext of our conversation is that one has to be very careful not to get hung up on the words out of the context, right? So pneumatic in one world may have a very different meaning than in another, right? But it literally in Greek, it's the pneuma is the spirit, okay? And the spirit is distinct from, or distinguished from at least, the sphuke, the soul, all right? So the sphuke is the principle of the life of the body, but you could say that the life of the body, the true life, if you want, put it in quasi-Aristotelian terms, is the life of the spirit.
Okay. But it's that's resurrected. It's not a corporeal.
It is corporeal, but it's informed by. So you go back to the
informed by the pneuma, not by the soul.
It's the soul and the body are informed by the spirit.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So that's an aside, but I think of it here because Kierkegaard is using the same kind of tripartite understanding of human being here, and the body and soul. That synthesis of body and soul is sustained by the spirit, he says. No sooner is the spirit posited than the instant is there. Nature's security is due to the fact that time has no significance for it. Only in the instant does history begin. The concept around which everything turns in Christianity, the concept which makes all things new, and you see this is a subterranean reference to the text that Kant is using. This is the book of Revelation. When at the end of time, when time comes to an end, what's the next thing that happens? The New Jerusalem comes down. You see, that is, there is the new heaven and the new earth. All things are made new, which is the reflection in the last book of the New Testament of, I guess, the notion which was first powerfully articulated by, I think, Isaiah, where God says, "I will make all things new." Right. So in the New Testament. Concretely speaking, that promise is fulfilled in the vision of the apocalypse, in which there is, at the end of time, a new heaven and a new earth. Right. So that renovation, radical renovation. So I'm saying is that even though he's not referring on the surface to this text that Kant uses in his own way, Kierkegaard certainly is talking in the same exact context. And the concept which makes all things new is the fullness of time, is the instant as eternity. And yet this eternity is at once the future and the past. If one does not give heed to this, one cannot save any concept from heretical and treasonable admixtures which destroy the concept. One does not get the past as a thing for itself, but in simple continuity with the future, and with that the concepts of conversion, atonement, redemption are resolved in the significance of world history, and resolved in the individual historical development. One does not get the future as a thing for itself, but in simple continuity with the present, and with that the concepts of resurrection and judgment come to naught. All right? So when the eternal enters into time in such a way as to create the instant, or sometimes the moment, okay, that instant or that moment creates a real, you might say, future and a real past. Or another way of putting it, it makes a real difference in time. All of the other differences in time, absent the entrance of the eternal, what Kierkegaard is saying, those differences are ultimately no difference. They're ultimately, they don't grab, right? They don't stick, right? Everything washes away in time. And so or you see what and here he's accusing Hegel, you see, of really kind of turning Hegel against Hegel, right? In other words, what he's saying is that how does he put it? The significance of world history, which is so fundamental to Hegel, you say, is being reduced here by Kierkegaard to nothing more than the infinite succession of non-lasting moments, right? Into a kind of nothingness, right? A nothingness which, from Kierkegaard's point of view, is more specifically the nothingness of abstract thought. To say, so in other words, it's as if Hegel has just gone too fast. He just assumes something he can't assume, right? In other words, if there is to be any true world history, right, not in the Hegelian sense, what Kierkegaard is saying is that then we have to go back to this notion of the instant in the sense of the eternal entering into time, and then, of course, we run into the major problem that this is an absolute paradox, that this is something that the mind cannot wrap itself around any more than in another context, in a Thomistic context, the mind can wrap itself around the notion that there was a first moment of time. Because in effect, you see, the incarnation here is being interpreted on the analog of the notion of a first moment in time. The qualification maybe being that for Kierkegaard, this would be the first real moment of time, the first real present. You might say the first, in the language that I would use, the first real now. You see, the first now that lasts, right? And the now that lasts, all right, is in some sense eternal, right? But it is, in another sense, paradoxically, the end of time, right? Now, okay. I think I want to generalize from that because I want to move into Husserl. I want just looking ahead by way of anticipation, somewhere in the text, in critique of Kierkegaard, which I think we covered last time, but we didn't cover it. I mean, we kind of went through it very quickly and didn't focus on it. I make an observation that Kierkegaard, like modernity in general, despite his radical criticisms of Hegel, who kind of epitomizes the positive modern self-consciousness, that Kierkegaard, nevertheless, even here, is assuming. Let me start this way. The basic notion is that he is somehow or other confusing, or maybe a better way of putting it, not distinguishing clearly between time and history. Right? And I don't think in the text, certainly not at this point, maybe at no point quite in this way, I positively perhaps say how that's so. And so I was thinking one way of understanding of what I'm saying in effect here is that Kierkegaard, because he doesn't sharply distinguish between history and time, thinks of the entrance of the eternal into time as the entrance of the eternal into history, because he's not making a sharp distinction between the two, and thinking of the eternal as an entrance into history forces him to have an understanding that the problem of faith, the problem of the passionate commitment to accept as true that in a particular moment of time the eternal entered, right, which is not intelligible for Kierkegaard, to believe that, all right, is the same thing as to say, is for Kierkegaard to swear, in my language, it's to raise to the second power the difficulty of all historical knowledge. In other words, in the Philosophical Fragments, Kierkegaard makes the point that all historical knowledge is some kind of belief or faith. Do you see? So when we believe that George Washington was a real person and really did the things that he is said to have done and so forth and so on, and we believe it as laymen on the evidence that the historians have gathered, put together, and there's all kinds of evidence, right? There are artifacts and there are documents and there are portraits and so forth and so on, right? But the historian who probably never sat down to seriously doubt this, there are no Cartesian historians, perhaps, right? Who didn't have a methodical doubt about, right? It would be tough to be an historian in that sense.
Hayden White.
Okay. The point being that the historian is relying upon a certain body of evidence. The more evidence, the firmer his willingness to, if I put it in terms that the Stoics or the skeptics would understand, is to assent or to put forth and then, in effect, to assent to the proposition that George Washington did live and he did do what he is said to have done because we have the evidence to support that conclusion. So historical knowledge rests upon that kind of evidence, which in many cases is very great. In some cases it's much less, right? But the Kierkegaardian point is that knowledge of any historical object is really not knowledge in an absolute sense, but it is some sort of act of faith or belief based on the evidence, right? It's a decision, so to speak, of the mind to take as a fact what is alleged to be a fact based on certain evidence, right?
But this is true of Herodotus.
Okay.
For Herodotus, myth was the key given, the key factor in history.
Okay.
It was not a collection of facts that generation after generation ascended to.
Okay, but I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, just to say that to say that history is nothing but the sort of transgenerational ascent to one report after another of handed down from generation to generation, the George Washington or any historical figure existed, did this, did that. Herodotus would say that in a sense that the more accumulation you have of the New York Times we know from the latest publications in the New York Times how little fact there can be in the paper of record. But
well, there's a good extreme negative example. In other words, you believe something because presumably you have the evidence presented to you that upon which you base your acceptance of this as true.
Yeah, I forget. Was it Heraclitus who was Herodotus's? I forget who it was. Who was Herodotus's sort of conceptual opponent in this idea of history? Thucydides. Yeah. So, I mean, he was into facts, but
he's into constructions of the facts. Herodotus is into telling stories. It's exactly you actually.
So Herodotus
I thought you were
concerned by Jason Blair's antics.
Yes, absolutely.
A contemporary historian.
Yeah.
Well, he might be concerned, but you mentioned the other day. Says, "You tell me, I believe you." That's Herodotus.
Okay.
Well,
all right, but I think we're getting a little bit away from the point. The point being, the Kierkegaardian point is that for Kierkegaard, history is a matter of belief, the judgment, the historical judgment.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll be more precise, right? The judgment that I make that such and such actually occurred in history is an act of faith with a small f, or belief with a small b for Kierkegaard. Because he has that understanding of the act of historical judgment or assent to the fact, when he looks at the entrance of the eternal into time, which is that without which everything just falls away, continues to fall away indefinitely into nothingness, and without which there is no present, there is no lasting now, you see. Without which, in effect, to put it really dramatically, which he likes to do, maybe not phrasing it exactly this way, without which, for Kierkegaard, what Kierkegaard is saying, and again, this is in the context of articulating what he understands Christianity to be saying, without the entrance of the eternal into time, here he's saying there's no present. But you could say it more boldly for Kierkegaard, and with no less truth, a little more power. Without the entrance of the eternal into time, there is no eternity. That's what Kierkegaard is saying. You see, that is, there is no eternity for me. You see, because I am this creature who is riddled through and through with temporality in this Hegelian world, right? So I am this finitude, and I am just eventually evaporating into non-being. So if I am to be rescued from this evaporative existence, the only way I'm going to do it, the only eternity for me is if into this world in which I find myself, eternity comes, if there is an eternal moment in it. And again, as we've said in a different context, the individual believer, right, is going to experience in himself the moment, the instant of conversion, if you want, that will correspond to the instant in which he believes, right? The so-called historical instant. But I want to come back to my point on history and time. But what I'm trying to get to is that in doing that, he thinks of the historicity of the incarnation as an historical problem squared. In other words, he starts with the premise that all problems of history are matters of belief. And so that does not... So the belief that the Word became flesh, to put it in more traditional terms, or that the eternal entered into time, the belief there, all right, that I have to believe that is not altogether a new thing, you say, but it raises the historical problem to an impossible level. That's what Kierkegaard is saying, right? So he thinks, in other words, that there is such a thing. Here's what I want to get at. He thinks, and by the way, who would fault him for thinking this, right? He thinks there is such a thing as history before the history in caps that's crucial to him. He thinks there is an ordinary history, all right? And what I'm suggesting is that in some important sense, which remains to be explicated, what I want to suggest is that in the thinking now occurring, this perfectly sensible notion that there is, generally speaking, a history before history, right, before the entrance of the eternal into time, is called into question, right? Minimally, or provision, or first and foremost, it's called into question, right? Or it's called into question and you never get beyond calling that into question. That is to say that the historical, that there is a history in the thinking now occurring, it may be not intelligible in terms of a preceding temporality. Right? In other words, when you enter into history and the thinking now occurring, when you have the notion of history itself, or history absolutely, all right, it excludes the notion of a succession, as it were, of nows, either before or after. All right. So, in other words, the history, in some sense, this eternal present that Kierkegaard is talking about, which is interrupting a succession, an otherwise infinite succession of non-staying nows, right, is perhaps, one way of provisionally starting with it, is perhaps replaced by a notion of history itself that in effect denies, or maybe denies, it's a little bit dialectical, either denies that there are nows as it were before or after it, or in terms of which it is to understand itself, or another way of putting it, reduces the ordinary history that Kierkegaard has in mind, reduces that to the same kind of insubstantiality, irreality, as the mere succession of, or time as mere succession in Kierkegaard, right? So that something of the staying power of the now. One of the questions came up early on in the course. What are we to understand by the thinking now occurring? All right. Well, I think in a certain sense that's the whole problem. All right. But again, provisionally, the thinking now occurring would be not separable from a world of past, present, and future, or a world in which past, present, and future have no staying power. Right? History would be in effect the moment existing itself, as I said, this is why I refer you to the answer that I gave to Chuck's first question, that history itself might be the moment itself existing itself in the form of beginning. Right? Now it's kind of abstractly wrought, but I just want to lay it out there on the airwaves, although it's there in the forum as something to think about, or to meditate on, in my way of speaking, and also to relate it to the analysis of Kierkegaard here, and to try and show to begin to show what the difference might be in the moment. Now, the other thing I want to say, generally speaking, before we get into Husserl, is that, again, I'm rereading this material. I'm very much impressed in rereading it. Maybe at the time I was impressed, I just don't remember. But I'm very much impressed by the importance to Kierkegaard, but not just to Kierkegaard, to Heidegger too, of this notion of simplicity. One of the things I thought to say was that at the time, not making the connection in my mind, I pointed out to you that Augustine had two fundamental categories in which he understood divine being, or the Godhead, or God, or however you want to put it. And the two attributes, as it were, you have to be very careful, they're not strictly speaking attributes. In fact, that's the whole Augustinian point, right? God is not a substance, which I think I went over, and that means that one of the most important reasons why Augustine will not allow God to be a substance is that substance has attributes, and therefore it admits of a kind of accidentalness, a kind of distinction that God could be something different from what could be predicated of God. Right? Subject and predicate, that's a distinction that's denied in God. The distinction between universal and particular, and therefore God is not, certainly in no logical Hegelian sense, you see. And this is another problem. Now, this is a problem. This is a deep problem. This problem hasn't gone away when Augustine may be dead 1,500 years, but this problem has not gone away. Right? This is the problem. This is the problem.
The problem of substantiality?
The problem of understanding a simplicity that somehow or other is creative, real and creative, but not able to be taken apart into the distinction of substance and attribute, or subject and object, or, again in the syllogistic terms, a simplicity which at first sight we want to say is, well, you think God is one. Right? That's the cry of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. That's fundamental. That is fundamental. And Christianity wants to have its cake and eat it. That's it. If God is as much one, I think you could make the argument intellectually, in a certain intellectual sense, God is more one in Christianity, because the unity of God allows for, when I understand that unity somehow or other to be an absolute simplicity, see, this is where it gets hairy, allows for a trinity of persons, or a trinity of relations, or some real distinctions in God, which are, however you see, and certainly Augustine must understand this because it's central to his whole analysis, is not the distinction between the three persons, whatever it is, okay, whatever it is. One thing it ain't a distinction between persona and actor. It ain't a distinction between the divine substance and attributes of fatherhood, sonship, spirit. You see, whatever that distinction is, it isn't that. But nevertheless, in the notion of the Trinity, if we can call it a notion, you see, a dogmatic notion, Augustine sees that of the two attributes, that's what started me in that. They're not attributes, right? The two things, right? What would be attributes of God, those two attributes that God is, are immutability, unchangeableness, and simplicity. Okay, and right away, I think you can say that the immutability part is old hat. I mean, that's Aristotle could have told him that. Plato could have told him that. Right? Plotinus, in his own way, could have told him that. Right? That the ultimate God, the first God, the one, does not change. Right? And even the unmoved mover in the Platonian universe, which in some sense, of course, doesn't change naturally, nevertheless, Plotinus says it moves. Reminded me of Galileo under his breath, right? So the unmoved mover moves, says Plotinus. Okay. So what I'm getting at is that if you focus in on what Augustine is doing there, without making a big deal out of it, you see, he's adding to the notion of eternity, unchangeableness, a notion of simplicity, which I think Aristotle has no need of. You see, but now simplicity is already a problem, and that's why I'm saying it hasn't gone away here at the end of the second millennium. Simplicity, as opposed to simple unity, do you see? Simplicity, and certainly God, and since God, the God of Augustine, is not, I cannot say of God that it's appropriate to say he is simple or it is simple. The way Augustine would put it is that God is simplicity itself, and that gets rid of the distinction between substance and attribute. God is simplicity, and Aquinas follows out this kind of thinking in his work 800 years later. Right? In other words, whatever you can truly predicate, as it were, of the divine being, whatever is analogously, as Thomas will understand it, whatever is in the analogously true to say of God, that the analogous speech concerning God in Thomas, which sets him apart from Maimonides. Maimonides had the notion that there were three basic kinds of statements, right? A statement which is equivocal, right? And we use that in everyday language to say that was an equivocal answer, meaning, I don't know what you said. I don't know whether you said yes or no, right? I can't relate the word to anything. I heard what you said, but that's an equivocation. You say so. Something is said, but it doesn't relate one way or the other to what it's said about. That's an equivocal predication, technically speaking. A univocal predication is where what you say is what you get. That is, the predicate is simply true of that of which it is predicated, of the subject. Right? It's univocally so. There's only one meaning, and it's clear, and it's coextensive, so to speak, with the subject. An analogous predication is a predication in which, in one respect, what I say is so about this. So it's not equivocal. In other words, I'm not up in the air. You see, it's not that I don't know. No, I've got something now. But it's not simply or completely or altogether the case. In some respect, although this is true of the subject of the predication, it's not. Okay. Now, this is
there any essentially univocal statement in this book?
I think not, but I would say that there is an absolutely analogical statement that the thinking now occurring is that helps me get into where I was going in Thomas. To finish the answer to you, that the thinking now occurring is, in a certain sense, the comprehension of what I would call the absolute analogy of being, which takes me back to Thomas. In Thomas, we're not just talking logical relations, all right? We're not just talking simple questions of predication, because for Thomas, who was in some sense a realist, right, in thought and in language, I'm dealing with something real, right? So there is not only is analogy the right way to go when talking about the divine being, right? Unlike finish with Maimonides. Maimonides' position was that all statements about God are equivocal, meaning not false, just they don't apply. And in that sense, they're false. I mean, in other words, if you think you can say anything adequate about the divine being, from Maimonides' perspective, you're wrong. All right. So in a technical sense, Maimonides and Thomas are in disagreement here. Right. Thomas wants to. He's not going to say that our language is adequate in any simple univocal sense to speak of God. On the other hand, he will not agree with Maimonides that this is all human talk. Just it's all merely our own understanding. For Thomas, we have a way which is real of talking about, and that's because there is in Thomas, most fundamentally, what Thomas would refer to as an analogy of being. Right, being itself is analogous. Right, so that notion. I mean, there's so much to do; it's impossible. But when we talk about the participation of created being in the divine being, you see, all right, well. So what does that mean? Because in some sense, Plato would talk about the participation of the world in the eternal being of the world, but it wouldn't have the same meaning, right? Because the participation is not simply in terms of a moving. Time is not simply a moving image. Well, it's so interesting. Plato's view, I think it's in the Timaeus. Time is the moving image of eternity. You see, but Thomas wants to have a more real relationship between the, if you want, the eternal divine being, essence, right, and the created being of the world, which it really shares in it, right? It's not simply an image of the divine in this. I want to say, I can say this of Thomas, it'd be more difficult to say it straightforwardly or without qualification of Augustine. It's not merely that the world is an insubstantial image, if I can put it that way, of divine being, okay, which in a certain sense, have to be careful now, in a certain sense is true in Augustine, right? For Augustine, it's a substantial image, but it's inessentially so, right? In other words, it's the image of that the world is of God or the creature is of God is a substantial image, but at the expense of having any essential being, right? And that was as far as Augustine really took it. By the time you get to Thomas, the world is both substantially and essentially participating in the divine being. So what I was starting to say was that there is a real relationship, a real participation, or a participation of both essential and substantial, and unqualifiedly real. Maybe I'll put it that way. And unqualifiedly real in the sense that, for example, on the contrary, Augustine is drawing up the creation from this kind of suggested pool of nothingness, you see, from which the world is converted into being. And I say, it's at least ambiguous in his phraseology, right? He doesn't have that crisp break with the notion of any kind of pre-existing nothingness or any kind of material, speaking logically, material notion of nothing. So Thomas, I think somewhere in the text, we bring up the fact that Thomas says ex nihilo can have either a meaning of being the material cause of something or of being just a orderly relationship, all right? So nothing comes before the world as order, not as matter. That's what Thomas makes that clear. When I'm saying minimally, it's ambiguous in Augustine. It may be more the way Augustine spoke or didn't speak than his intention, but that ambiguity is completely erased in Thomas. Well, the ambiguity that I'm pointing to in Augustine is not unrelated to the fact that the creation is a substantial but inessential. In other words, in the language that I just invented, for Augustine, the creation is not an unqualifiedly real participation in the divine being. Is this what I'm saying? But in Thomas, the creation is an unqualifiedly real participation now. Okay, so now we're not saying it's divine, but it's an unqualifiedly real participation in divine being. Right? That's a fundamental difference between Thomas. But you can see where it's going. You see where the world's going. Because the world, when I go from Plato to Augustine, the world has already become very real. It's already become very real. Okay, I mean the world. I mean the world of our experience has taken on in Augustine compared to Plato. It has taken on, qualifiedly or unqualifiedly, it's taken on a substantial reality that it's lacking in Plato, right? But when you get to Thomas, it's got an explicitly unqualifiedly real participation in being. Okay, and what I'm saying is that the direction, therefore, is setting up the possibility of the modern appropriation of this unqualifiedly real world that has evolved through the impression made on reason by the incarnation, and it took a while. See, it reminds me of Augustine. I think I told you. I can't remember whether I tell these stories so many times over the years. I don't remember whether I told it last week or 10 years ago. But the point, it's not a story so much, it's the notion that... Now I just lost the story by making that comment.
Long time impression, incarnation.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the main point. Maybe the story come back. That the impression, as I said in response to one of the questions that Chuck asked, that the incarnation made an impression. I know what the Augustinian point. What was the Augustinian point or Leahy's point? I'm not sure. The point is this. Doesn't make any difference. The point is, it's Augustine's point in some sense, that God saves the world in the incarnation. In one sense, he saves it immediately, spiritually. But why does the resurrection of the dead, why does it take an indefinite, in other words, if the outcome, I think this is a Leahy point, but it's Augustinian in feeling. The ultimate outcome of the incarnation for Augustine is the resurrection of the dead. That's the ultimate. That's when the party's over and we move on to that new heaven and new earth, and everything is great, right? So, but the gates of hell were opened. Here's the point. The gates of hell were opened on Easter Sunday, right? Or midnight. Okay. So mankind was saved spiritually at a certain relatively identifiable date in history, you see? But the full realization of that incarnation, its full impact, is reserved, right? Well, why? Because man really is a creature living in time and space, right? So it would be, in some sense, magical and not authentic for the resurrection of the body to prescind from the actual working out of human history, so to speak. Okay? So in that sense, the change takes account of the material with which it's dealing. Right? It's somehow the divine intervention adapts itself in some way to and this, I guess maybe think of this, the substantial reality of the world. So in the notion of the creation of the world, and in the notion of the incarnation in particular, the world is becoming more substantially real as time goes on, because the rational animal, man, being in some sense inextricably temporal, spatial, time bound, right? It takes time to absorb, to absorb the impact, as it were, in every sense of the word, intellectually and maybe existentially, maybe ontologically, to absorb the impact of a real change which is believed to have happened at a certain point in time, right? So in that sense, the creator adapts himself, so to speak, to the creation. It takes time for the full realization of what has happened, because what has happened is not setting aside the nature of the world in a Platonic sense, you see, but is fully entering into and dealing with the world in some sense on its own terms. All right, so let me stop there and let's turn into today's assignment on page 248, which picks up with it's an approach to Husserl, but begins again with Kierkegaard, and I say on page 248, about 60% down that paragraph on 248, outside of the individual, conceived of at the extremity to which he has been brought by the absolute pathos of modern thought, set out in its essential completeness by Hegel, there is for Kierkegaard, for all practical purposes, no relationship to God. So God is for Kierkegaard not to be confused with the human, the all too human, you might say, notion of God, which is majestically articulated in full, you might think, by Hegel. He writes in his journal, the law, which again is grace, which Christ has established by his life for man's life, is that you have to do as a single person with God. Whether you are clever or simple, highly gifted or only slightly gifted, it does not matter in the least. Relate yourself as a single person with God, O divine grace, willing to have to do with an individual man, with each single man. Dare as a single person to have to do with him. He will adapt everything to your capacities and possibilities, so first have to do with God, not first with the rest. But the fact that to exist, existence has something immense. But the fact is that to exist, existence has something immensely frightening for a poor man. So he is afraid. He does not dare to set himself first in relation to God. The animal in him thinks it is cleverer to be like the rest. Every existence which thinks first of being like the rest is a wasted existence. And since from a Christian standpoint it has happened through one's own fault, it is a forfeited existence. All right, so Kierkegaard's delineation of Christian individuality is a spiritual monadology in which psychosympathetic man is able to come into existence by virtue of a commitment of his entire temporality or finitude to the law of grace established by the life of Christ, according to which law God is related to this world and not otherwise, that is, according to the law of grace. That is, by a kind of perfect freedom, that is, in a way in which God need not be related to the world, as let's say over against Hegel. God's relationship to the world is an essential part of the self-realization of the Hegelian Godhead, right? So the God of Kierkegaard's faith is not related to the world as a form of its own self-realization, to say. And therefore, it's a matter of grace. It's a matter of a kind of perfect freedom, nothing required, and not otherwise. This spiritual identity, if achieved, is that by which one's worldly being is placed at God's disposal absolutely. Thus, by becoming spirit, a man is raised above his finite existence as a rational animal. And this spiritual element transcends what I call there the psychopathetic man. So, going back to something we were talking about earlier, in an earlier passage, the spiritual as opposed to the pneuma, the pneumatic man. Again, we have to be careful. This is Pauline language, not
Stoic or
yeah, right. But you see, there are overlaps in the language. So the man of spirit, or the spiritual relationship, that which informs the psychosomatic man, the man of body and soul, right? So the relationship here is a spiritual relationship. Thus, by becoming spirit of man, but the key thing in Christianity, and presumably the key thing in Kierkegaard, and I think you can make a good case for it, is that the spirit is not an alternative to the psychosomatic man, right? That the spirit informs the mind and the body, and the classic doctrine of the resurrection of the body is just the kind of ultimate working out of that implication. Do you see? In other words, one is not saved from one's mind or from one's body, from one's naturalness, if you want to put it that way, right? But one's naturalness is saved, right? And that's a very Pauline idea. Thus, by becoming spirit, a man is raised above his finite existence as a rational animal, which human existence as self-determination is spiritually understood nothing but sin. But this new spiritual identity by which the historical is made eternal and the eternal is made historical is, as Christ's life makes clear, nothing but suffering in this world, although eternally it is exaltation. All right. Over on page 250, after the quote about 8 or 9 lines from the top of the page, for Kierkegaard, the exaltation of an eternal existence come upon in time is, as long as time continues, nothing other than to be sacrificed, which insofar as the man lacks an eternal determinant in himself, either before God or before man, is not to be confused with self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is a universal potentiality of human religiosity, or perhaps an ideal of world historical speculative philosophy. But to be sacrificed is to suffer in time without the knowledge of an essential existence belonging to the self, or with a passionate faith in an absurd fact that is one that is unintelligible, and in modern thought absolutely so, namely that the eternal entered time in such a manner as to make the individual qua individual eternal, in such a way that in this life he must suffer humiliation exactly proportionate to his future exaltation, must become less than nothing, since he is no longer in accord with reason itself, not in accord with his own humanity. Now this must be understood post-Hegel, okay? In other words, precisely because Kierkegaard, in some sense, as I put it earlier, concedes reason to Hegel, right? He concedes to Hegel that Hegel has summarized reason's own understanding of itself in an absolute form, precisely because, in other words, he has no intellectual or rational, that is, Kierkegaard, has no intellectual or rational basis upon which to stand, right? His faith then becomes an absurd thing because he's conceding, he's admitting, or he's ceding to Hegel all the rational ground in the discussion, right? So he makes that concession, as it were, to Hegel. That is, he accepts it in a certain way uncritically, all right? I mean, in other words, it's kind of ironic. I mean, at the same time, he's critical of Hegel for being abstract. This is a point to fully appreciate the paradox in Kierkegaard, right? So in a certain sense, you would say, well, he doesn't take that thinking seriously. Okay? But that's a misunderstanding. He does take that thinking seriously. He doesn't take that thinking seriously as thinking. You see? He wants to exist it. So the absent-minded professor, the absent-minded Hegel's problem from a Kierkegaardian point of view is not that he has done all this grand thinking, but he has left himself, the concrete existential individual, as we would come to say, he has left himself out of that picture. He has abstracted himself altogether from that picture, right? So the concretization that Kierkegaard wants to bring about is to, in a certain sense, well, I guess I've said this in a certain way, in a different way, but it comes coming around at it to exist the moment. You see? So you could look at the Hegelian, the great big Hegelian colossus of absolute self-consciousness as the moment writ large in the abstract. Make any sense? You see? And so, how about taking this great, terrific idea, which, as far as that goes, even though Kierkegaard likes to poke fun at it, you see, because you see what he's saying is, I think he uses this little joke somewhere in his writing a couple of times. It seems to me he did it a couple of times about the tailor who's done a lot of sewing. One thing he forgot to do was to knot the thread at the end. Do you see? That's a Kierkegaardian little homey analogy for what he really thinks about. What he thinks about Hegel. See? It's not that Hegel isn't a great. What's the word? Tailor. Yeah, very good. A great tailor, a great seamstress, a great sewer. What you say? It's just one thing he's forgotten: to knot the thread. He's just forgotten knotting the thread for Kierkegaard is existing. This idea, you see? This living idea, by the way, not just in that. In other words, This is a great living colossus that Hegel has conceived of. He forgot to tie a knot in the thread. He left himself out of the picture, so to speak. But once you introduce yourself into the picture, then the picture, as a picture, doesn't have the value. That's no longer the point. You have to exist this. Yes.
I was just thinking, taking it more radically,
Yeah.
if you don't have a thread, not at the end of the thread, the whole thing actually comes apart. Not
Yes,
that
yes,
You just leave
yes.
yourself out. The whole thing.
That's right. That's true. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And certainly Kierkegaard feels that. But on the other hand, you could look at it this way. Look at it this way. That in his own way, he's doing what he can. You might look at to keep it from coming apart. In other words, if you're going to keep, in other words, if he appreciates what you just said, which I think he does, right? That unless you exist this, it'll come apart. It does not have within itself the ability to sustain itself.
And that's also the haunting power of Hegel, that whatever Kierkegaard does, from a Hegelian perspective, just reinforces the notion of an antithesis. So it's just continuing with the Hegelian project to begin with. You know,
Yeah.
if you're a true Hegelian, you
kind
see
of,
Kierkegaard maybe
yeah.
is just right on
Well,
board.
that's why
as echoing it.
every attempt to oppose oppose Hegel,
Hegel.
is interpreted by somebody as a move within Hegel.
Right,
You have
right.
That's done with Kierkegaard, it's done with Husserl, it's done with
Yeah,
Heidegger,
that's
and
right.
it's done with Leahy by Mr.
Right.
Altizer.
I don't think it's actually done. He would
Well,
like
he
to
would
be
like
able
to
to
do
do
it,
it.
yeah.
I don't think he's done it.
Well, isn't that what doesn't Derrida say, or is it something? I think Derrida says that his deep fear is that at the end of history there will be Mr. Hegel waiting for us to.
I told you
read us.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how does Leahy reinsert, I don't know, I suppose Hegel, by again removing the self? I mean, how does, or putting it differently, how does the critique of Kierkegaard that Hegel's left the self himself out? How is that?
Himself, right?
How is that dealt
I mean,
with?
Kierkegaard understanding by that. Kierkegaard meaning his concrete, worldly, flesh and blood,
Yeah,
total self, so to speak, in that
Right.
sense. Yeah.
right. So in Leahyism, if that's a word, the self is transcended. It is certainly there's no place for the self, is there?
Right. It's left behind, so to speak.
Left behind, right. So in leaving, I just wrote down that maybe I wrote down incorrectly that Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel was that he had left himself out.
Right. Oh, okay. And Leahy's
So
critique of Kierkegaard is that in order to solve the problem that he, in some sense, correctly perceives in Hegel,
Yeah.
Kierkegaard, puts his little self
I see.
into the picture.
Right.
Right? Or
Okay. So what does Leahy do with?
get rid of the notion of
with
self.
both the little and the big self?
Yeah.
My experience so far is that self actually dies of concreteness. It doesn't die of nothingness. It actually dies of reality.
Okay. All right.
In
All right.
some kind
Yeah.
of kenosis. See what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
It
Go
doesn't.
ahead.
It doesn't. You don't just kind of fluff out and disappear.
Oh no.
The self.
Yeah. No.
It
no.
actually goes
Well, we have a
so
semantic
far
problem.
in that you're out.
Okay.
So, okay. So by concrete,
Well,
I mean,
it goes so far in that it's no longer to be found, and
Yeah.
you, on the other hand, are completely out.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And in that sense, you're completely concrete.
Right.
And
That's what I mean by dies of concreteness.
Right.
As opposed to
Right.
fluffing
Right.
out.
You're completely here and now.
Yeah.
And I would just call that, because we have a semantic problem,
Right.
which we've been given by history, and by the way, it's not the only one, it's just the central one. Like, I want to get rid of the note. Because I just haven't got time to do everything. I use the term itself all the time in the thinking now term.
Noted,
Right?
yes.
But you noted that, right? And it's kind of bothersome, but I don't want to stop. But really, we have to get rid of the term itself, because it's a carryover, it's a residuum of self-consciousness. And so, but then you're looking around, and I don't know. There could be another thing, but I have one notion I have, which I don't think I have articulated anywhere that I'm aware of, but I may have, maybe. I have an unwritten piece which may or may never ever appear somewhere, in which I'm working toward this. I think, but I have the notion that the equivalent of the width of the itself is something like, and this would be a kind of violent usage, at least to begin with, a kind of withstanding, a withstand or a stand with. Right? So it's kind of awkward. But nevertheless, forgetting the awkwardness for a moment, I like the, and it would be taking advantage of certain things in the language, right? So to withstand has a notion of some kind of resistance, you see. But on the other hand, to withstand, if I slow the film down a little bit, is also to stand with. So the ultimate notion, which I one day in here, I think in some context or another, talking about what happens to the circle in the thinking now occurring. Now I'm just coining something off the top of my head. The circle gets absolutely punctuated. That is to say, the continuity that forms, the continuity in which the circle is grounded is absent, right? But the circle somehow or other coheres, right? So that it's a rough image, but I think it's a useful image for me anyway. So that the points on the circle are no longer continuous with one another, and nevertheless, in a way, they withstand one another. Do you see? They stand with one another, and they withstand one another. That is, they maintain their integrity. I want to get back to this notion, right? Their simplicity in this difficult sense of the word, right? Whatever it means. So it's not a simple unity, right? And I think this has to do with what you're pointing to it, right? In other words, if I'm not buying into this, right? But I'm just provisionally. If the self goes so far in that it's, in my language, it's altogether gone. It's no longer retrievable. It's absent. And in the meantime, you have become absolutely out, or come absolutely out. Then that might be a good concrete. And I would just call that what it means to be a person in the full sense of the word, stripped of any notion of self, any form of self-consciousness attached to person, right? So now you are the most concrete. So that, I think that's what you were driving at. That in this sense, you are the most concrete self. The self goes away by concretion. So just to try and keep the linguistic distinction, which I think is more than simply a linguistic problem, what was the self now becomes fully and completely a person. And the idea of simplicity that's functioning here from Augustine through Heidegger is talking about simplicity today, right? Everybody wants whatever the simplicity is. It's hard to put your hands on it. On the other hand, could be that it's as easy to put your hands on this simplicity as to put on the book, or on this body, living, breathing, talking body here and now in this room, and thinking body. You see. So that simplicity, unlike the simple notion of unity, which is not, it's no simple alternative to unity, do you see? But I go back to the idea of the Trinity. In the Trinity, the simplicity of God, to Augustine, I'm sure means, you see, the unity which allows for that kind of difficult distinction among the persons, whatever it is, which is not a difference between substance and attribute, subject and object, self and other. It certainly isn't that. It certainly isn't that, you see. So for real difference. Now, what's the importance of real difference? What's the importance of simplicity as opposed to unity? I mean, unity sounds pretty good. If I get my act together, right? But my act together is also, I think, more like simplicity. You see, in other words, the difference between unity abstractly and simplicity is that simplicity somehow or other, which we would like to have a better grasp of, right? Simplicity is that kind of unity which is not at the expense of some sort of difference. And what I was about to ask out loud is, well, so what's so important about having some kind of distinction in the unity so that we can call it simplicity? What's at stake there?
Otherwise, you're back at the Greek kind of.
Well, yeah, but what's the matter with that? I mean, The Greeks are all right, but no, we don't want to go back. Okay, but why don't we? In other words, what would we lose, and what we would lose when losing the distinctness that is in every way not incompatible, put it in the negative, with simplicity. What we would lose in losing that distinctness is what distinctness is all about, and that is, it is the basis of intelligibility. Do you see? It's the intelligibility, right? So to have the unity, which is, I think, from time immemorial, some kind of an ideal of reality, to have that unity in no way at the expense of intelligence. See, Aristotle had great, you see, right? So to have that unity altogether without the sacrifice of intelligibility, that would be the triumph of simplicity. And maybe all of these guys are been looking for 1,000 or more years. They're looking to surface. Thinking now occurring, it is the surface. Okay, but they are looking maybe to surface that simplicity.
And not just those guys, just as a side note.
No, okay, yeah, well, no, right, we got enough trouble here, right? Without, but you're right, yeah, not just these guys.
Wait, I want to understand this. So,
All right.
is the connection between simplicity and intelligibility, does that have to do with the simplicity of reason or the simplicity of the transcendental essence of existence? Like, well, how do I get from simplicity to intelligibility? I understand the question about the
Right.
distinctions, but I don't understand how you get there from here.
Aristotle says to be and to be one is the same. At the beginning of one of the metaphysics.
Okay.
So is it that sense, that to be intelligible, to be a distinct object, to be something about which it's possible to know what it is, are indissolubly linked, and so that if at an absolute position you did not have not only unity but some way of transmitting that unity to creation, you would lose intelligibility in that sense. If you had a kind of unity like I'm not,
Like Aristotle.
No,
Is that what you're saying?
I want to say I'm not buying into this, but I'm trying to
Yeah.
understand it. That to have it like not like Aristotle, but say like Plotinus's,
Right.
where the unity is fundamentally something that's indefinite, and its way of imparting distinctness to the forms and therefore to the things is really to impart along with it a mysterious unintelligibility throughout the entire of being. So you're trying to say you want, and what you hope they want or think they want, is this holding on to both Shema Yisrael on the one hand, and the identifiability of the things of the world as
Right.
having final character that doesn't dissolve into an abyss of emptiness or nothingness or mystery or enigma or all those other predicates that I listed.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. However, the more technical question, I think, is the one that Ali is asking. I don't know, again, we can make that a simple answer to that, but my first inclination is to say is kind of like to deny the trip that you set up.
How do you get there from here?
Yeah.
Okay.
That somehow or other, if the simplicity and the intelligible, or the simplicity ought not to be able to be distinguished from intelligibility, and I think that's what the thinking now occurring is about. It is and I think the difficulty, nevertheless, with the thinking now occurring, in addition to the fact that it's very new, and all new things are kind of strange, but I think the more fundamental difficulty of thinking now occurring is that it requires, and now this is again, the language has got us trapped. You see, all associations. I want to say, but I'm not sure I'm going to say what I mean. or mean what I say, it requires a certain self-abandonment, right? To think the thinking now occurring. In other words, think the thinking now occurring is difficult in some sense, but certainly the difficulty is magnified by the fact that I don't have a chance of thinking it. In other words, what I'm saying these particular guys, right, Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Heidegger what they have in common is a kind of an attempt to clarify the absolute, do you see? And that fits with what I just said we were saying about Kierkegaard, right? In a certain sense, Kierkegaard is a profound Hegelian who just wants to tie a knot in the end of the thread, which is no mean thing to do, right? And therefore he can laugh at Hegel, not because he doesn't see the majesty in Hegel's attempt, but he sees the foolishness of attempting to do it without tying the thread, right? Well, analogously, you could generalize that. What these guys are trying to do, each in their own way, could be understood, and is being understood here in effect, as an attempt to clarify the absolute. So we're going to be talking about clarification here, right? When glass is really clear, that's when people send themselves to the hospital by trying to run through it. In other words, if it's really clear, it's not an object, so to speak, right? It doesn't stand, you see, and in that sense, the flatness associated with the thinking now occurring it's an absolute clarification. What's going on, I think, is an absolute clarification of consciousness, is what's occurring at this point in time, you see, or in history, or as history, right? So an absolute clarification of consciousness is the first immediate thing I'm going to experience is nothing to grab onto.
Right.
You see? So instead of maybe self-abandonment, a letting go altogether of the self-reference is the condition for seeing the world in this clarified way. Something like that.
Sheer lucency and consummate perspicacity.
Can I ask?
Amen.
The reason we can't go back to the Greeks is that to do so would be to deny history.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement.
All right.
Yeah.
Is the progress from unity to simplicity somehow or other not just the denial of self, but a denial of history by way of transcendence? I mean, is the idea somehow or other to ignore all the differences historically in thinking and somehow or other prescind from them? I mean, with the understanding that the way we got to that opportunity was to fully understand the complexities of the non-simple, if you will, that has preceded us, but then to recognize that at the heart of that lack of simplicity was, in some sense, the self, and then is that where we're going here?
Well, something like that. I would say, broadly speaking, what I heard you saying, I don't have too much trouble with. I mean, that's somewhere like what we're doing. But the one little fly in that ointment was the word self-denial. So, and I don't know that you really meant that, and it may be just that we're in the habit. Right? So I would make the distinction, I think I do somewhere in some text, probably in this text somewhere, make the distinction. It's not so much a question of, it's certainly not self-affirmation, that much is clear, but neither is it self-denial. So,
but I mean, the reason we're going through all this contradictory stuff, all these clowns, have nothing better to do than to sit down and, I mean, I don't know what these people have to do, but they didn't have to do what Nancy has to do, right? She's got class, right? I had to be absent for a couple of reasons, no doubt. Could happen later. I mean, even you might. The snow, whatever. I mean, but there are all of us, except for these guys, apparently, had to deal with realities. You were a consultant for a while, and because of other realities, right?
You're going to lose me in a minute.
But I'm just.
What's it got to do with Kierkegaard?
Well, I'm just saying that, speculation is a wonderful thing, speculation in the sense of,
Right.
of thought or whatever, but ultimately the concreteness perhaps of what you're coming to, that Ali was talking about earlier, that this idea of this, everything kind of gets into the cement so much that, we can't, in a sense, we don't have, if I may use the expression, we don't have time. We no longer have time to fiddle with all of this. We have to understand all this, but we don't have time for it any longer.
Okay, but what I want to say,
Because we have a new thinking.
yeah, right, but
What about this thinking?
But the new thinking, in other words, goes back to the reality of history, so that in some sense, all of the thinking that has occurred up until this point, it's not, how can I put it? It's not as if it didn't occur, right? In other words, so we have come to a certain point, and we have actually come there. So since we're not simply talking in some external sense about walking down a road, but coming to this point in this, walking down the road in this way is a kind of thinking in response to experience in general, right? We think in response to experience. And then if you put in the key link here in terms of what is being said about the essentially radically new now, the incarnation is something that is experienced by mankind, if you want, for want of a better term, humanity, and the experience, by definition, this is a completely extraordinary experience, and mankind has been thinking about it in the person, particularly of Western thinkers, for the better part of 2,000 years. And so we have been brought through, in other words, it's not because I don't think this is, in any sense, the thinking now occurring is just another, as Altizer might like to suggest, the tail end of key lectures, maybe this is another form of idealism. Just say, in other words, the notion here is that our thinking is in response to a reality, right? In other words, this is not, there is, in some sense, just to speak easily, there is an otherness that we're dealing with, you see? Now, one place you can hang that otherness is God is the other, right? In one way, in one way or another. But in any event, we are thinking in response to something real that is other than ourselves all along, and that informs this history of thought, and the intelligibility of where we're at this point in time cannot, I think, be sustained without reference to that. And so, in that sense, to wrap it back into something I was saying about what I heard you saying in a related but slightly different level of focus. So it's not a matter of either self-denial or denying the history of thought up until this point, right? Denying its reality or its, in some sense, its relevance to where we're at. It's not a question of denying it. On the other hand, it is a question, if I can put it more positively, of recognizing that we now, I don't want to say we have an opportunity. I mean, but I just speak everyday language. In a certain sense, we do have an opportunity, right, to think in an essentially new way, right? And maybe opportunity is not bad because this is not part and parcel of the coincidence of simplicity and intelligibility. Is the achievement of what another thing that is on the table here in this clarification is the achievement of a real freedom. I mean, it's so abstract, okay, But freedom is critical here too, right? So so in that sense, right? In other words, this is not a fatality, right? That what is occurring is not a fatality, and in a certain sense, one is free, right, to hold on to this as what you so it's neither a question of so one is free to so I said it's neither self-affirmation nor self-denial. It's neither an appropriate response to the opportunity of the moment, if you'll pardon the expression, to either deny the importance of this history, nor is it an appropriate response to affirm this history now. So that's a kind of a delicate distinction to make, right? But it's typical of thinking now occurring, and there is a kind of abstract anticipation of it in medieval consciousness generally, and therefore by analogy, more proximately, there's an appreciation of analogous, formal appreciation of this in American consciousness, that the notion that there is a third way, so to speak, right? It's neither to affirm nor to deny, you see, and that third way is integral to the thinking now occurring, I think. So,
and that's what Husserl introduced. I'm saying he didn't introduce it.
well, why do you say it is more important? What are you pointing to?
Well, when he talks about suspending belief, that's not a request.
Oh, the epoche.
That's what I mean. You don't agree?
Well,
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll try and deal with that. Okay. Let's deal with him. On page 252, I think we have the lead into Husserl. In the bottom of the page, there's a paragraph beginning at the bottom, toward the bottom. If in Kierkegaard we encounter the individual qua individual as the first moment of the absolute thought of existence, standing in opposition to that absolute thought, standing in its own finitude or non-being, and denying reality to the absolute outside of its thought, radically distinguishing thought from existence, so similarly in the phenomenology of Husserl, we encounter the species qua species as the second moment of the absolute thought of existence, standing in its own finitude or non-being, rising to the form of an absolute transcendental subjectivity, and denying that the existence of the truth of appearances is capable of satisfying the sole criterion of a pure or absolute transcendental subjectivity, self-evidence. So let me just slow that film down a little bit. It occurred to me in rereading this again that Husserl, what he's going to do most directly and famously is to deny the substantiality of the world experienced in consciousness. He's going to bracket it. Okay, so that must be what you meant.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, because I just have to correct myself.
Oh, okay.
He's not denying the substantiality of the world, right? But he wants to bracket it. So yes, I'll meet you halfway.
Okay.
It's an analogy.
Yeah.
That's right. The bracketing is an alternative to either affirming uncritically, that is accepting uncritically the world of our experience as substantial, but it's also an alternative to denying the substantiality of the world, right? So it's, in that sense, it's a third alternative. So the bracketing, the epoche, in that sense, is at least analogous to what I was pointing toward. But I do think that okay. I may or may not say this somewhere in the text, that the thinking now occurring is like, compared to Husserl, it's like the absolute epoche, if you can imagine such a thing.
You say it's a bracketing of the mystical.
Yes, I do somewhere say that, right. Yeah, of a mystical...
The thinking occurring is a bracketing of the mystical?
Yeah.
And that might be...
It's an absolute epoche.
Yeah, okay.
What does the word mean?
It means to bracket the epoch. It's in English we have an epoch in history.
Right.
In other words, a certain period
Okay.
of time that has identifiable beginning and end. So that's the meaning of the term. So what he's saying is that we should bracket. We should put out
Suspend.
suspend, or I mean you can have your brackets going either way. It doesn't make any difference. In other words, you want to put out of play the question of the substantiality of our conscious experience and just look at it without making any commitment to its being an experience of something substantial or insubstantial. See, so take your mind back. So one of the things he does right away that I quote in here is that he redoes in his own way, of course, the Meditations of Descartes, you see. And the basic, I mean, a lot of criticism, but the basic project there, unlike Descartes was trying to what? He was really trying to establish, in a way, Descartes bracketed the world, but he bracketed the world only in the sense that he was intent upon establishing for himself, to his own satisfaction, self-evidently establishing the substantiality of the world. You see? And Husserl says that was the mistake. Now, a reason he was led to that mistake is that this is where I was thinking I was going to go, more or less, is that when he, and I don't know that Husserl was the first person to make this criticism of Descartes, and it certainly wasn't the last person to make it, and we alluded to it another day in here, that when Descartes undertook the exercise of the Meditations, he, on the face of it, he doubted everything. But we notice, for example, that his idea of God, which he finds innately present in his consciousness and which he cannot ascribe to himself as the ego, as a finite ego, he finds that, and that becomes that which comes to him, which proves to him, by virtue of his presence in his consciousness, that there is an infinite being, because only an infinite being could give him an idea of positive infinite being. That's basically what he's saying, okay? Well, and so we would observe, and Husserl in effect is observing the same thing, right? Well, wait a minute. That you say it's innate, but didn't it really come from the history between Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas? That you got an idea of God as infinite being, is it right? So in other words, uncritically, Descartes, the Descartes of the Meditations, that ego has uncritically, is still thinking of itself, I think in Husserl's terms, as an animus, right, as the soul of a body, maybe abstracted from the body, you see what I'm saying? But still thinking of itself in natural, in terms that are taken from its being as a natural substance. Okay, so I want to prescind. Therefore, so I was trying to get at is that this pure subjectivity of the purely phenomenological subject abstracts, so to speak, brackets abstracts from not only the substantiality of the world, but in a certain sense from its own substantiality. Do you see? And therefore, it is relative even to Descartes, it is in a way that Descartes was not disinterested. So Husserl's project, and now this is also interesting because these echoes keep coming back, right? In other words, one of the things you would say about Greek science, one of the reasons that you would say accounts for the fact that the Greeks didn't invent the TV set or the telephone, right, is that the Greek understanding of science was, in some very real and important sense, disinterested. Right? In other words, knowledge was not, I mean, the radical distinction that Aristotle makes between theoretical mind and practical mind. Theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom. It's like that, see, a modern would say, like the leap you have to make from reason to intellect, from the rational soul of man qua species to that divine something or other that eternally is the pre-existent, as it were, act of knowledge without which there would be no reasoning, right? Well, yes, there's an intimate dependence of reason upon that, but that's it. In other words, reason is dependent upon that, and reason's whole goal, so to speak, not only in Plato, but even in Aristotle in his own more modest, careful way, is to live in accord with that unchanging, eternal something or other, that true self, that, when push comes to shove, that's the ultimate commitment of the ancient mind, right? Okay, so in that sense, not, I could say quite literally, not self-consciously so, the ancients were disinterested. I mean, they weren't self-consciously disinterested. Husserl is self-consciously disinterested. Do you see that? So, or in Husserl we have self-consciousness assuming the posture of a kind of radical disinterestedness, you say, and therefore it is radically disinterested, I could say, in the substance of the world, or another way of saying it's radically disinterested in existence, in the ordinary sense of the word. Yeah.
There's a kind of pure exuberance in Husserl that's unlike any other thinker, in the sense that he's just thinking infinitely more problems.
Right.
And endless categorization, endless divagation, endless excitement about the possibility of pure description and pure abstraction.
Yeah. Now, who wrote Monsieur Test? Anybody know? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Well, when we think of
French,
yeah,
Frenchy,
well, when we
Valerie.
think, huh?
Valerie.
I think it was Valerie.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Okay. Doesn't make too much difference, but it comes to mind because Monsieur Test was a guy who, in some sense, completely was Mr. Head, was right, pure intellect, right? And in a certain, it may be, I don't know, a certain parody of the phenomenological states, right? But yes, that is, and the exuberance comes from the fact that there are no limits now.
Yes.
That you can think without limit, right? And the ego. See, poor Descartes is a piker compared to this. You see what I mean? So when we redo the Meditations after 300 or 400 years, you see, Descartes is, he's only got a limited amount of time to engage in the thing, because he has to get back and invent some inventions, right? He's got to get us to the moon and
solve all problems,
heart transplant and so forth and so on, right? So underneath the theoretical, it's kind of an abstract and theoretical procedure. We call it the methodical doubt in Descartes, right? But there's I was going to say the method is madness. There's a practical end in his methodology, right? In other words, the method for Descartes has an explicitly and avowedly practical upshot, right? Now, I don't know if it'd be fair to say that there's no practical implication to what Husserl is doing, okay? But it's certainly not focused in that way, right? In other words, but it is, now you got me thinking, it is a kind of act of faith, perhaps, would you say? In other words, what is he trying to clarify in a certain sense? He's trying to clarify science. You see, he's trying to clarify the scientific. Yeah.
You have to look at with Husserl really what his own sources are. Husserl was right at the center of the establishment of mathematical logic. He was a faculty member with Cantor, and they were in communication, and he was involved much more profoundly in the problems of the origins of mathematics than Wittgenstein or Russell or the other luminaries. And so the usual picture of Husserl is that was his youth, and somehow he gave up all of that in order to do phenomenology. But more recent scholarship on Husserl sees it as absolutely continuous. So his concerns are the concerns of late 19th century mathematical logic. How do you actually put science through mathematics, through logic, onto finally an absolute basis? That the absolute nature of thinking, of the intellectual spirit of Hegel, actually hasn't been realized yet, because mathematics has come to a point where Kant's statement about logic having had no development from the time of Aristotle to the end of the 18th century has proven to be totally false, because of developments in mathematics and science in the early 19th century. So that's his concern. His concern is to discovering consciousness, to how to get it really all together.
Yeah, and therefore, deeply implicit is once it's really all together, it can actually get on with the project more successfully, right? And it can actually transform the world. So in a certain sense, the critique of Descartes is a two-edged sword, right? In other words, Descartes has to be revisited.
It's leading to your Toppler eventually.
Okay, yeah, but in other words, Descartes made a mistake in not being radically disinterested enough in his procedure. It's not that we disagree with the practical aims of Descartes, but he was impatient on Husserl's point of view. I mean that in a structural sense, not necessarily psychologically, right? In other words, so phenomenology is a kind of perfect patience spent on clarifying the foundations of consciousness and science, the ultimate obvious implication of which is to actually more perfectly affect the moral goal, so to speak, that Descartes articulated as the basis of his project, right? To improvements for mankind. So that's I think I would say that's pretty much taken for granted here. And the question is, we want to do that. We want to do that better. I mean, in a profound sense. Let's take a look at what he says about the appliqué. If I can put my finger on it here, on page 254 and following. Well, let's start at the bottom of 254. We can no longer accept the reality of the world as a fact to be taken for granted. It is a hypothesis that needs verification. Does there remain a ground? So the reality of the world is a hypothesis. That means it needs to be verified, so it's put in suspense. Does there remain a ground of being? Is not world a name for the totality of all that is? Might it not turn out that the world is not the truly ultimate basis for judgment, but instead that its existence presupposes a prior ground of being? He is specifically following Descartes. We make the great shift. So he says himself, right? So this is going to be at once a critique of Descartes, but it's going to be a critique of Descartes following his lead. Right? We make the great shift which, properly carried out, leads to transcendental subjectivity. This is to shift to the ego cogito as the apodictically certain and last basis for judgment upon which all radical philosophy must be grounded. We can no longer say that the world is real, a belief that is natural enough in our ordinary experience. Instead, it merely makes a claim to reality. The entire concrete world ceases to have reality for me and becomes instead mere appearance. However, whatever may be the veracity of the claim to being made by phenomena, whether they represent reality or appearance, phenomena in themselves cannot be disregarded as mere nothing. On the contrary, it is precisely the phenomena themselves which, without exception, render possible for me the very existence of both reality and appearance. I no longer judge regarding the distinction between reality and appearance, or between substance and lack of substance. I must similarly abstain from any other of my opinions, judgments, evaluations about the world, since these likewise assume the reality of the world. But for these, as for other phenomena, epistemological abstention does not mean their disappearance, at least not as pure phenomena. This ubiquitous detachment from any, detachment, and elsewhere he'll speak of disinterest, from any point of view regarding the objective world we term the phenomenological epoche. Everything in this world, all spatial temporal being, exists for me because I experience it, because I perceive it, remember it, think of it in any way, judge, value, desire. It is well known that Descartes designates all this by the term cogito. For me, the world is nothing other than what I am aware of and what appears valid in such cogitations. The whole meaning and reality of the world rests exclusively on such cogitations. And then the consequence of this, and this is part and parcel, in effect, of his critique of Descartes' mistake, in the last three lines on 255, I am not the ego of an I, the I of this updated meditation, the phenomenological meditation. I am not the ego of an individual man. I am the ego in whose stream of consciousness the world itself, including myself as an object in it, a man who exists in the world, first acquires meaning and reality. Okay. On page 260, I speak of...
This is the first disinterest since Aristotle, in a sense. Everyone else has had a serious interest in the substantiation of essential truth or essential reality.
Well, no, Kant would be a step.
Yeah.
But he's still saying that it's still the reference point where even when we can't get to it, it's still some notion that it's there. And that
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit complicated. I would say maybe not the first disinterest, but maybe the first pure disinterest, right?
Okay.
Disinterestedness in its purity, without needing to intellectually to justify itself in relation to anything else. And I think of Kant. Kant has a certain disinterest, and he has it in his morality, but then his science and morality are separated, right? So I think this is more radical, but maybe it would help us to reflect on the fact that this, like Kierkegaard, bounces off Hegel. So another way of saying, at some risk of saying a pure disinterest, might be saying, in a certain sense, an absolute disinterest. So whether explicitly or implicitly, as in Kierkegaard, so in Husserl, a critique of Hegel, right? In other words, accepting something of the absolute claim of reason, do you see? But in effect, being critical of the failure of Hegel to achieve the goal, because Hegel still confuses the absolute, I'm looking for the word, for the absolute structure, or the structure of an absolute consciousness. He still confuses it with this world. And what happens here right away is this world just becomes an example of an infinite number of possible worlds. You see?
Yeah.
So Hegel has got as far out of the picture scientifically as you could, but he had abstracted himself. I mean, Hegel would say, this was not Hegel. Kierkegaard's problem is that he abstracted himself from himself. But from a scientific point of view, Husserl's posture, it's not that he abstracted himself from himself. That part doesn't. See, in that sense, Kierkegaard wouldn't be any happy with Husserl.
Right.
You see, because Husserl is not saying to Hegel, your mistake was your little self was in there. I mean, it comes to the same thing, but that's not the focus. The focus is, maybe Kierkegaard is right. Maybe Hegel forgot all about himself as an individual, but he didn't forget about this world. You see? Now we got to forget about, and you see, and deeply, of course, as is implicit in the whole Cartesian exercise, right? And in phenomenology, as it turns out, right? I mean, and in Sartre, very explicitly, I am the center of this world. This me here is the center of this world. So are you, I know, all right? So we'll kind of be friends. We'll share, as long as we can, until push comes to shove. Okay? But as long as things are good, we got plenty of money and booze and so on, we're not going to have any problems. I'm not going to have any trouble. Are you? No. Okay. So what I'm getting at is that from a Kierkegaardian point of view, Hegel left the concrete existential individual human being out. That wouldn't bother Husserl, although he did. He apparently got rid of the individual human being, but he didn't get rid of the world that was centered in it. Right. So, in a certain sense, in a direction, as it were, opposite to Kierkegaard, his objection is what? There was still too much of Hegel in the Hegelian synthesis. It wasn't the individual that Kierkegaard is concerned about, too much of Hegel, but it was the world of which, from a Kierkegaardian point of view, absent-mindedly, Hegel was the center that was still central. You see? So Hegel identified himself with world history. From a Kierkegaardian point of view, complete stupidity. Okay, but nevertheless, you see, he identified himself as an individual. We'll go back to our comments on his attitude of the state. My true concrete being is as a citizen of the state for Hegel. Right? So much so that if I perfectly realize that, I am universalized, as it were. Right? Okay. So yes, kind of probably the absolute disinterest is what is formulated here. Meaning, therefore, not only not am I the ego of an individual man, as he just said, you see, but as he will say elsewhere in here, the world that we're the essence of, we're not focused on the essence of this world. What we're really seeking to arrive at is the essence of any world, or the essence of world, or what is worldliness, of which our experience of this world would be but a specimen or an example. Was somebody going to say?
Yeah. Isn't this the first guy who isn't thinking at all in Christianity or thinking about God?
Well,
that
there's
we're
one
studying?
good reason for that was that
Yeah.
he was a secular Jew.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a good reason.
But
He was also a Catholic convert, I thought.
He was?
later on,
I believe so.
Wow.
I don't know whether he was a
I
Catholic.
don't remember him thinking about God.
I
Did he
think-
think about God?
Well, you know, I don't know because
I don't
Also
know.
from
It rings a bell. He might have been. He might have been.
I believe so, and I believe that's one of the peculiarities of that little backwater called Hala, whatever the school's name
Right.
was, because both Cantor also was from this almost Morano-like family.
Right.
He was Jews, but they secretly they converted, but he was Lutheran, but he secretly remained Jews, and at the same time he was having this correspondence with these Thomists in the Vatican.
Oh
about-
well, okay. Now it's
Something
ringing a
is
bell.
going
Yeah,
on
there is
behind the
there is a
scenes.
connection. Right.
Yeah.
You're right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. But it would be perhaps, I don't know. So we don't know. But anyway,
I'll find out by next
he
week.
kept it out of his project. That's what you're
Yes.
noticing,
Right.
right?
Yeah, which means like he untied that knot again.
Yes, but
Right.
but that would be consistent with what I pointed out in the case of Descartes. Descartes explicitly leaves his faith and his morality outside of his critique. So science here is separated. You see?
That's
So
secretly
now that we've touched on that somewhat awkwardly, nevertheless it's a good opportunity to just anticipate something else. In other words, the thinking now occurring is conceived of as not only not prescinding from faith, right? But to make the complication more complicated or the simplicity more simple, it's not only that simplicity and intelligibility go together, but simplicity and intelligibility and the thinking now occurring and faith coincide. Okay, so whatever there are definite anticipations and similarities, right? And the epoche, the third way, is one of them. Nevertheless, to the extent to which you would be hard pressed to find the element of faith appearing in.
There are whole sections.
Now, however, there is a
in
practical
Idaean,
faith, I
actually.
think. Yeah, I'm sorry.
There are sections about faith in Idaean and the whole
I have to-
possibility of a phenomenology of religion,
Right.
which I never studied. So
Okay.
I'll take a look at it this week.
I read it, but too long ago to recall it. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll both look at it and see what we come up with. Okay. Now, how do we get to that?
Well,
Okay. I just wanted. All right. Oh, I wanted to do the. I want to just take a look at what I call the true self. Husserl's true self on page 260, about 6 lines down. This true self of Husserl's meditation would remind us of the Aristotelian essence, or true self of the man, which is his absolute priority to the order of the universe, except that essential immortality of Aristotle, is not self-evident to reason. It would remind us of Hegel's absolute reason, which is ex hypothesi self-evident, except that absolute genus is ground to a universal synthetic judgment of existence, which is a way of saying what I was saying a little more briefly before, that in Hegel, the thought, as absolute as it is, and as forgetful as it is of Professor Hegel, is not forgetful of the world, and it's the absolute judgment of existence in a way that existence is bracketed in Husserl's phenomenology.
I'm sorry. There's
yeah.
actually there is material in Husserl in which he tries to actually build it back, and he has arguments about why it would be unlikely that the world is not the way it would seem to be when constructed by intersubjectivity and from this sort of book. And he has a whole series of arguments about that. It's just that he doesn't. It's like he doesn't actually come all the way out and then talk about history and politics and anything like that. But it isn't that he has abandoned it permanently. I don't think that's the actual thrust of it. He just likes it up there where he's hanging out.
Well, I think this is the ground condition for having to leave the world in order to come back into it might be the basic move, right? And the coming back in, I think there is something of that in Husserl, but I think it's fair to say that he doesn't fully arrive.
No.
Right. But putting it that way reminds me, in a certain sense, of the movement in Kierkegaard in the Concluding on Scientific Postscript, which I think I alluded to in a different context. That Kierkegaard goes through this exercise of moving from the aesthetic, intellectual, to the ethical, to the religious, the highest form of which religious consciousness is religiousness A, which is the piety of the religious person who, in some sense, confident in his eternal being with God, is resigned to give up the world in some in some real sense. He contrasts that with Christianity, defined as religiousness B, in which I have to go through all of that, and then I encounter the absolute paradox in the form that I don't rise to as it were, a pre-existent eternal being, but I must, as it were, turn around and come back into the world spiritually, that is, in the sense that I must find in the world the object of the faith that I must have in order, that I must have, and more importantly, I think, and the faith, the content of which must be true, despite the fact that it's absolutely opposed to everything that I can understand, if I'm going to have any eternal happiness or well-being or being, right? So in a certain sense, what you're referring to in Husserl, which more vaguely I articulated earlier as that he hasn't abandoned the practical goal of Descartes, but he's trying to purify the means toward arriving at it, right? Okay.
One more piece of the thing, which is that the actual origins of phenomenology in Husserl are the rejection of the notion that mathematics and logic have a psychological base.
Yes.
So the contrast, the extreme contrast, is phenomenology on the one hand, which is not a psychology.
Right.
That it could be a psychology later on the basis of having a completed phenomenology of consciousness, but the phenomenology as itself is not psychology.
You see, this is a kind of rationalistic, naturalistic, modernistic form of the beginning of the resurrection. The reason I say that, go back to our discussion some moments back of the pneuma, as opposed to the psyche and the soma, that is the spirit that Kierkegaard is focused on, you see? And the spirit, in effect, informs the psychosomatic man. What is the equivalent of the pneuma in Husserl? It's this phenomenological transcendental subjectivity, do you see? Which is not to be confused with the psyche.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're all on the same team, but you can't get them on the same court, right?
They may be in the same sport. I'm not sure that they're in the same team.
Right? But you see, all right. So that this, and it goes back to this other issue we're having here, right? In other words, and so if we were to get if the spirit, hey, if I got the right spirit, I come right up out of the grave, man, right? See, if the principle of the life of the psychosomatic man is a divine principle, an eternal principle, then there's no surprise that the body should be put back together again and go on forever. If I can clarify absolutely the grounds of scientific investigation, do you see, then the psychosomatic project of Descartes is realizable in a way that it hasn't. So we're dealing with the salvation of the world. I mean, that may be the biggest difference from the ancients. You see, Plato and Aristotle, it was a holding game. Plato, we have to be fair to Plato. I mean, Plato wrote the Republic, so Plato had a real interest in the zoon politikon, as Aristotle would put it. He had a real interest in this rational animal running around in the world, but it was subordinated in some sense, right? Going back to just the way in which, even in Aristotle, the rational soul is subordinated to this divine something in it which pre-exists it, as it were, and survives it, you see, in a way that Aristotle cannot be clear about with respect to the rational soul itself. So what I'm getting at is so everything was turned upward, just as in the cosmos, the Aristotelian universe is seeking God, or to be like God. It's seeking the rest in the unmoved mover. It emulates that as best it can at various levels. the best way it can do it is to move in the same place, that is to move without moving in some sense, you see. But Christianity says that God all of a sudden came to life, became aware of the world in such a radical sense that his awareness of the world was the bringing of the world into being, and then was so enamored with what he had brought into being, decided at a certain point when things were really going downhill, right, it seems that all was lost, to personally intervene, right? So the whole direction of Christian consciousness is that the divine being, the ultimate, put it abstract a little bit, that the ultimate reality of the world has in mind the salvation of the world. So the ultimate, when we talk about modern science as opposed to ancient science having a moral intention, right, in Descartes, I mean, this is profound. It wasn't a personal idiosyncratic move on Descartes' part, right? In a certain sense, I guess he was more discreet. He was, we don't give him enough credit because he didn't mind lambasting the Aristotelians. But in effect, if you judge by what he was doing, his project was also a criticism of theology. Right? It was also a criticism of a Christian theology which somehow or other took the notion that God wanted to save the world and had transformed it maybe into God wants to take me out of this world to be with him in heaven forever. Do you see? So one way of understanding modernity, and not necessarily in a cynical way, is what I'm trying to get at. In other words, it may have an underlying very good intention to in this practical mode, because I use that title, right, the infinite practical and so forth and so on, to take the divine revelation and to, as it were, to fully implement the
love of the world.
Huh?
The love of the world. Yeah,
the love of the world. And therefore, in the long run, you see, and this is where I think Augustine could. Now, Augustine would be, he has a lot of problems because of his place in history, and we can't take him out of it, really, right? But there is that strain in Augustine which is fundamental to him, his appreciation of the creation, you see, and his, I think I told you the little thing about his puzzlement over, am I going to see God with my eyes? But I mean, he takes that with a kind of utter seriousness, you see, and if you were in the 13th century, you'd say, what? That's not important. Right? But Augustine was important, right? So that somehow or other that the world, and this is the apocalyptic note, you see, this is the end of the New Testament. It's the apocalypse. And it's the new heaven and the new earth. Well, that's a great idea, but how about if the reality of the salvation of the world is a reality, then we should expect that the world it's not going to be a magical appearance of a new heaven and new earth, right? In other words, it's going to take place in, just as the salvation of the body takes place, according to Augustine, in history, over time, in keeping with the nature of the body. The soul is immaterial for Augustine. Therefore, the soul, when you die, for Augustine, goes right to heaven. Your soul was saved on, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on, whatever that, I don't know what month it was supposed to be. I should know what month that was. Had to be in spring, right? March, whatever it was. On that Friday afternoon, your soul was saved. You see? And so Augustine says, well, why would he imagine the interlocutor? Why wasn't your body saved? Well, because your soul is immaterial. It's perfectly appropriate to the nature of your soul that you were saved from eternal damnation by the crucifixion. But for your body all of a sudden to be immortal would be not in keeping with the nature of your body. That's Augustine's answer. It's very pragmatic.
Likewise, history in terms of...
Yeah. Okay. So if you look at it, I was thinking, that's what I was thinking. Now, can I capture this thought again? Augustine, the profound impact of Augustine, that I had a particular idea. It'll come back. I think it must have had to do when I was thinking about Heidegger. But he is profoundly with us here. Augustine's mind is, his assumptions, minus, let's say, the limitations of his historical moment, if you know what I'm saying, minus the fact that, right? So anyway, what I'm getting at, not to get too complicated here, so in Husserl we have, in this very abstract, so. It's not a question of making pious statements about the divine, to prove that I have faith in my. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The phenomenology itself is its purity, its disinterest, is the way of contributing to the bringing about of the new heaven and the new earth. If I use the ultimate goal of the New Testament, you see, it becomes in its own way the ultimate goal of human consciousness, certainly in the West, and now maybe you see it may be destined, as it were, to become the ultimate goal of global consciousness. Of course, we know from the history thus far that in the process of its realizing itself in time and space, this transformation of the old world into a new world, it itself, the consciousness, undergoes transformation. So we don't expect to say that the new situation is going to be a simple repetition or extension of the forms of the past, nor do we need expect, I think, and I think this is in thinking now occurring in a lot of parts of this text, there are at least hints, right, that the thinking now occurring, while it's really new, essentially so, to be technical about it, essentially unprecedented, is not the final, absolutely final realization of even what is being realized now for the first time in a way that was never previously realized, right? So, okay. But anyway, so the, so now his conversion to Catholicism becomes even more interesting, assuming that there is this deep thing going on here, which, by the way, transcends. First of all, in other words, this is the divine working itself out in human history and human consciousness, right? And these guys are, I say, on the same. They're on the same team, if not on the same court. They're playing their part somehow or other with others, right? In this outworking, you see, of that something or other that was introduced into the world for the first time in that first century, whatever that was, when the lights started going off, and Chuck says everybody's trying to hold it down, trying to bottle it, contain it, so on. Whatever happened there, you see, something really happened. It would appear. I mean, if you judge by the results, right? If you go by the results of the effects. Okay, should we make a stab at?
Could I ask a question? In response to what you just said about Husserl being, the divine working itself out through this thinking. On the other hand, you say on 252, and I stumbled over it. But if modernity is man's work and not God's work,
Right.
then its passing is to be anticipated. But on the other hand, the modern thinking is, as you just implied.
Right.
So where does one go with the other, or is it?
Well, first of all, every thinker is allowed to contradict himself.
All right.
Okay.
I don't It's Rich's questions.
Whether you're going to say required.
Well, sometimes.
Everything is forbidden.
But I don't think it's really a contradiction. It needs exposition. Modernity is man's work, not God's work. With the possible exception of Hegel.
And you just said Husserl
Well,
And Altheiser.
and Leahy.
No, he's
well,
not
all right.
modernity.
Let me try my answer first, then you can shoot it down. I would say that in modern consciousness, the modern part of it is this self-centeredness. I mean that in a technical sense, right? Because there is a lot of disinterest in the self-centeredness of Descartes, and right? So it's not a narrow, right, selfishness or anything like that. But in other words, the appropriative move of modernity, I would ascribe that to the man side of the equation. And I would characterize it as perfectly understandable, by the way, perfectly natural, perfectly normal, and probably a universally present phenomenon. As in some, now this is paradoxical. I want to take it, as soon as I say this, I'm going to take it back, so I don't get shocked. Some sort of lack of faith. and yet at the same time, the reason I want to take it back is, so in other words, the divine is not defeated by man's lack of faith, right? So in man attempting to, there's some biblical story here that's trying to break into my mind, trying to take it upon himself, you see, to save himself is a mistake, and yet that mistake does not interfere with the divine intention to achieve this.
Job.
Huh?
Job.
Yeah, maybe Job. I don't know. There's one. I can't. But I think it's something. So I think it's a. There's a tension there. If I jump ahead to the thinking now occurring, I think the thinking now occurring is speaking of these intolerable coincidences, is a coincidence of receiving and producing, right? So in other words, I think in a certain sense, in the thinking now occurring, I think what I'm driving at here implicitly, and maybe only implicitly because I may not have been thinking this on this page, is that what's new, the new opportunity, is the opportunity to be in a reality in which the just as the alternative between self-denial and self-affirmation is behind us, so to speak, then the alternative between man's work and God's work is behind us. I think it's that. Without erasing, and therefore we need some third thing analogous to the bracketing idea. The alternative between God's work and man's work is no longer on the table without erasing the distinction between the human and the divine. Right? So I think the justification for this way of phrasing it on this page is that in thought before now, right, the God-man question was phrased in either-or terms, in terms of that required either the absolute or at least the relative affirmation of the one or the other. I think it's that. So it's more the either-or here, right, which is assumed as integral to modern consciousness. In that context, I think it's intelligible to speak of man rather than God being to the fore, as it were, right? But it doesn't prevent something deeper from going on, and as we come, I think the attempt at the clarification of the absolute, as I characterize these three guys, brings things to a head, so to speak. So in other words, I think as we come to the end of the second millennium, so to speak, right, we're coming to a point at which we have a kind of an extreme, what I speak of in the case of Heidegger, poor Heidegger, we'll have to, as an extreme extenuation of modernity, a kind of thinning out of modernity, which allows at least a formal anticipation of, and maybe a formal sense of the salvific intentions of modernity, even though they're unrealized. In principle, unrealizable, I would say, because of the self at the heart of the matter, right? The self-reference at the heart of the matter. So there's a certain opaqueness, there's an attempt to clarify consciousness in modernity, the clarification of which is in the service of the salvation of the world, but it's done under the aegis of, as Descartes would say, being a mere man. In other words, there's an explicit human enterprise, and the expression mere man, and the fact that the truth of what Alia points out, that God is explicitly at least absent from the phenomenological enterprise in its purity, right? is that God can't be, that the either or between man and God is not overcome. It's assumed all the way through, right? Is not totally incompatible with the fact that man has taken it upon himself in some way in modernity to achieve, right, in practical terms, something like the new heaven and the new earth. It's something like that. So I don't think it's a simple incompatibility.
I think there's another element here that has that same kind of paradoxicality, that it's always in the back of my head when I'm thinking this history with you, which is, you may either know about this and hate it or not know anything about it, but it's basically anthroposophy, the Rudolf Steiner.
I don't know much about it. But
it may be something that's on your plate, but it has a picture of the. First of all, it's Christian theosophy. It's not non-Christian, as for instance theosophy, the Blavatsky stuff doesn't have a Christ as the anthroposophy does. And a big part of its reading of it, a big part of its concern with a kind of history of consciousness or history of mind. And one thing that it focuses on around the time of the incarnation is the emergence in world history of the valorization of the individual soul. So there's something in the course of the entire history. In fact, if you take that's true, there lots of people bring all kinds of things to bear, including the tomb paintings on Egyptian late, Ptolemaic sarcophagi with the big eyes.
What was that word? Valorization.
Valorization.
Was it?
Attaching value.
Attaching value to make valorous. But this idea that something is emerging through the Greek world that comes to a head in the center of Hellenistic times, which is the appearance of the very notion of the human soul, which is actually not unique to Christianity, but is unique to that time, so that you have all kinds of other ways in which the concern for the soul of the salvation of the individual soul is appearing, and that pressure of individuality as a spiritual entity, it could be, you could see that through the entire course of the 2,000 year whatever, that undergoes all of these different permutations and all of these different exaggerations, and that in a sense modernity's version of individuality is the extreme attenuation of that, in the sense that the individual reaches an extreme point and is sort of foisted on his own petard, or left out in the cold or in the dark, because the dialectic or the dynamism of the creation of the individual and the crucifixion disappears, or is not part of that story. Anyway, I'm just blowing all that into this picture here.
Okay, all right. I can't really make a substantive comment about it. Okay, I want to just so that we can say we said something about Heidegger to begin with. We need to say more about Heidegger, but let's jump right away to page 271, where we get something of the essence of what's happening here, I think. On page 271 in the first large paragraph, in the thinking of Heidegger, we come upon the third moment of the absolute thought of existence standing in its own finitude and non-being, in opposition to the claim of that thought to be for the universe its substantial being. In Heidegger, the universe qua universe opposes itself to the specification of the individual as the immediate determination of what is in totality. The universe qua universe, or what is in totality, while at the same time refusing to acknowledge its dependence upon absolute reason, nevertheless demands to be held in its immediacy. Again, in response to Chuck, I call attention to something, I guess it says in the clarifications, where he talks about the questioning of being a long springboard, which is so long that Heidegger says there's a tendency to forget that at the end of the springboard there's the necessity, or the demand for the necessity of what he calls the leap off the board, right? So the questioning of being is not the end for Heidegger. The end, somewhat analogous to Kierkegaard, is some kind of a leap off this springboard of the questioning of being. So even his this thinking that he is doing, if I can put it that way, a thinking which is not the thinking of objectivity, a kind of non-objective form of thinking, a kind of receptive thinking, right? Analogous perhaps to what you're pointing out in the case of the Greek notion of receiving of reality, is nevertheless a preparation for a leap. And I think it's a question. Although I'm inclined to think that Heidegger, in some sense, has leapt in this context into the in-between the history of thought as it has existed. Speaking of something else we were talking about. So we said neither self-denial or self-affirmation, neither a denial nor an affirmation of the history of thought, right? But a being beyond it. And Heidegger, in his own way, is perhaps also, in reviewing the history of thought, redoing the history of thought, rethinking the history of thought, right, is in the process, or sees, certainly conscious of the necessity, as he puts it, to leap off from the questioning of being, do you see? Leap off into what? Well, something analogous to the 20 or 40,000 fathoms deep of the Kierkegaardian leap, something without support, so to speak, at first blush, I would think, at first blush in Heidegger. But here's what I'm trying to get to. But for him, this is a leap into a between the first history of thought and the first history of man and another, perhaps a second, certainly another history of thought for Heidegger, right? So in other words, we want to get into this a little more deeply next time. Next time we're scheduled to kind of start into the thinking now occurring. So just to jump the gun a little bit here, one of the differences is going to be what? That the thinking now occurring thinks that a thinking more perfect than the thinking that Husserl and company are attempting to surface, in fact has surfaced as the surface of reality, right? And in that sense, it also leaves behind what in its own unique way will also appear to be the preparatory leaping, not only the preparatory leaping or the necessity to leap in a Kierkegaardian sense, personally, but also the necessity to leap in the, for want of a better term, very dangerous term, in the sense of totality, in the sense of the whole, to leap in the sense of the world, right? In Heidegger, right? So leave the leaping, the need for the leaping behind would be the difference, right? But nevertheless, we might spend some time in trying to figure out in what sense, if there's anything to this idea that this is it's still man. I mean, see, that's interesting about the man-God versus thing. See, still in Heidegger. I mean, now this is not our everyday, ordinary man simply walking down the street. This is man characterized in terms of Dasein, right? This is man somehow or other appropriated to being, right? This is belonging to being, all right? So, but nevertheless, man is here, instrument in some sense. The instrument of being here, in some sense, is obedient.
The preparation for these gods that may or may not come.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing is that everything that man or Dasein can do is this preparation. The image I have is you've got a horse that's over here with a perfectly formed saddle,
right,
and you're sort of floating in the air with a perfectly formed behind, and they're kind of approaching each other. And if this is right, then thinking now occurring is you're back in the saddle again altogether. The approach is no longer the issue.
Yes, that's right. And so looking back into Heidegger, the problem in Heidegger from the perspective of thinking now occurring, if that's the correct way to put it, not quite accurate, but is that Heidegger, in a certain sense, never gets beyond the anticipation. He never gets beyond the approach. He never gets beyond the nearness, as close, as near, as infinitely near as one comes. One is not quite arrived. And in the contributions, he speaks quite heavily, therefore, of this second history, this other history of man. Yeah.
The later book, I mean, because the Contributions is an early book which he withheld
Right,
until
right.
after all these lectures had been
Right.
published. But what is called Thinking,
Mhm.
that book, where
Mhm.
there's this refrain of that which is most worthy of thought in this most thought-provoking of times is that we are not yet thinking.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
theme is the entire theme of Heidegger from
Yeah.
beginning to end.
Right.
And so the question is whether the thinking that he is anticipating is a thought that remains in the open, in the sense not that the question is to be closed in some new way, but a discovery of the modality of openness
Right.
itself
Yeah.
is the arrival, and what that would mean for thinking. I mean, that's how I take the whole enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think we have a kind of absolute opening
Yeah.
at the moment, but we'll stop. So we'll spend a little more time on Heidegger, but we'll do the next. We'll kind of marry them together because it's a good transition next time. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.